What is filicide? That is the act of killing one's own child. A deplorable act, but also a common act. 43% of murders committed last year were committed by a family member. 43%. Oftentimes, when a family member kills another family member, it's difficult to prove it because your DNA is going to be all over their stuff anyway. You live in the same household. If you kill your parents fold your clothes. So your DNA is going to be there. Now, we've got the government statistics and also government articles on this where rather than vilify the predator as we do with men, a man must be predatory by nature, and a woman does it because she feels it's necessary for her safety or because she's got mental problems. We already know about the mental problems. We already know that the majority of these mental problems are created because of bias. And like we've taught every black person in America that if they get busted doing something wrong, just pretend it's because the officer's racist. Just pretend it's because the property owner is racist. That's not to say that there isn't racism that goes on. It's to say that in my lifetime, I have endured more racism from black people. Actual physical violence because of the color of my skin than I have ever seen out of white people towards black folks on the street. Ever. By comparison, racism about black people is relegated to myth. When you've got, in Boulder County, they want to play the statistic of a black male is 5 times more likely per capita to be arrested and convicted than a white person in Boulder County. Well, no. That is not true. The reason for this is because the majority of the time that they arrest a black person, that black person is homeless and a roll-through. Somebody who they can say is mentally ill. Somebody who either has schizophrenia and delusions or somebody who nobody cares about, and now they're showing severe signs of long-term abuse and neglect. And of course, in a male, that is a sign of, well, they must be violent people out to hurt you and out to harm you. If a man exhibits a trauma response, it must mean that he's violent. Statistically, according to the government's own statistics, filicide is more likely to be committed by women. According to many college studies, not done by special rights groups, special interest groups, they do try to put more numbers together, whereas if a woman's hate group that hates men doesn't get their numbers doctored right, well, they'll take a part out of it. Okay, well, it turns out that women kill their children at a much higher rate than men do. A much higher rate. However, do we look at the violence of it? Why is that lady staring at me? Well, I guess she turned around now finally. She was staring real hard. Like, almost broke her neck craning sideways walking past. Oh. Now, when it comes to filicide, we get these women's groups that want to claim that it's a man's world that does that because they don't want to consider drowning your child to be a violent crime. So they want to change the word to violent, claiming that men are more likely to be to death. Well, no, that's not true either. Women are far more likely to be physical aggressors towards their children. far more likely to be physical aggressors towards children. And this comes from us teaching girls that they're okay to hit somebody for once for free without getting hit back. But then they're taught that that is specifically towards men, aren't they? But then when you get two women who have been taught that, and then they get into a lesbian relationship, well, they're starting to think of their counterpart in that relationship as that person's the man, I'm the woman, so it's still okay for me to hit them, but it's not okay for them to hit me. It's also more acceptable for a woman to call the police situation, and people are more likely to call the police if it's violence with women involved, or a woman involved is the victim. So when they hear a woman screaming, they're more likely to call the cops. When they hear two men yelling at each other, not so much. Then the cops show up, and they show up 3 times a week sometimes. One officer, he was talking about how, he always thought that women were so kind and so gentle, and then he lived in an area where there was a large population of lesbians, and nearly every other call that he got was physical assault from one lesbian to another. The screenshot on the front of this is from a .org or .gov. But even in that, they want to type about and talk about how it's more alarming when a woman does it. The reason for this is because when we hear women's excuses for killing their children, they are so fucking twacked out of their goddamn minds thinking that's going to pass for anything anywhere. And yet it does. Her bullshit does pass. Somehow magically, when she kills her children, we're supposed to feel sorry for her, not her children and not the father. How disgusting is that? So we've got all these women's groups. We get the actual statistics, but we have to dig for them. Because between looking at the actual statistics and looking at stuff that is paid advertisements by women's groups, they're really hate groups towards men. So we have to scroll through a bunch of stuff that's specifically for women or about women or only women's violence. Only women's violence. Only violence against women. But somehow we got to go to Australia or Canada or New Zealand to hear or read about any statistics of what it's like for men. How it is for men. The actual numbers for men. Did you know that our numbers here in the United States for people who are actually speaking out about our rights, they come from New Zealand. People in New Zealand are taking the statistics and running the numbers. And I just want to let you know that the guy who does this, it is run by a man. But the person who does the majority of the organization is his wife. His domestic partner is what he says. Now, neither one of them are transgender. They're both, the gender they were born with, just trying to fit in with what the social norm is allowed. And there's a group in Australia that's similar. They don't mess around with the numbers for the United States. They just focus on what's going on in Australia. Australia's numbers are actually nicer than ours. And there are women that are speaking up in Australia about how horrible it is that men are treated in Australia. Meanwhile, they took their model from us, the United States of America. Same with Great Britain. Same with New Zealand. New Zealand has the same problem as Hawaii. The homelessness above the, or The homelessness rate with the locals is tremendously high because all of the property is either owned by the government or by whites through treaty or through European companies that had money, whereas the Maori didn't have shit. Neither do the Hawaiians. Homelessness is off the scale. It's very similar to the poverty and reservations on the mainland here in the United States. Now, I, as a white guy, am only supposed to care about white men. That's what you want to sell. That's the narrative that you want to sell. You want to sell the narrative that I'm only interested in your holes. And that if I don't get what I want, all I'm interested in is making more holes, because men are all violent rapists that will kill you if you don't let them rape you, and so on and so forth. When you teach women that they can get away with doing whatever they want by playing victim, you're making a world that is unsafe for all of us, because men have no recourse to defend themselves against such things. And women don't stop to realize how hard it is for us already. While we are expected to listen to you tell us, no matter what we're going through, that at least we don't have menstrual cramps. At least we don't have menstrual cramps. At least we don't have menstrual cramps. We're lucky that we don't have to give birth. We're lucky that we don't have to give birth. At least after you've given birth, that baby is out of you. Whereas you stick us with your burdens for our entire lives. Your burdens. Yours. We are expected to drop everything for you, and if we don't, we are horrible misogynists. We're expected to take your abuse and come back to you whenever you want us to, and leave whenever you want us to. And if we don't, you'll destroy our lives. If a man decides he's done with you and he leaves you, you go around and slander his name and talk about what a horrible person he is. 2 weeks later, after you've told everybody he's a homosexual that touches little boys and wears girls' underwears, then you want him back. Then you whine and pine and cry and you're lonely and you want him back. You couldn't stay single for 2 weeks. And after you went around door to door and got on Facebook and openly accused him of all this stuff, then you're whining and pining. You want him back. He owes it to you to take you back. No, he doesn't. And we got these women's groups, many of these women groups, because they're taking government funds, because they're taking your tax dollars. They're not allowed to be sexist, but their bias is there nonetheless. Whether they're allowed to legally or not, but there's no teeth to enforce the law. They're still allowed. Sure, it says it's illegal, but it's still allowed because no one cares. No one cares about violence against men or the rapidity or rampant nature of it. There's men that I know who have been assaulted in front of me by their girlfriend on multiple occasions in public, and nobody ever called it in. We had some maintenance guys working on the this morning. They're still working on it. So if you hear somebody talking in the background and giving measurements, that's a working man. Anyway, there was a study done, most of these that I look at by University of California or a lot of West Coast stuff, but one of them from Boston, this is an East Coast college, did studies on like 130 cases in 5 states, each one different regionally. They picked 2 different regions of the United States, and they picked a Democratic state and a Republican state, or a Democrat state, a Republican state, and they had to choose one liberal. So when they did these studies, they separated them so that there was the These are all jury trials, by the way. Every one of the cases that they looked at were all jury trial. Now they chose ones that were very similar so they could so they could show the outcome and the difference. And they showed that in 90%, and this is average, in 90% of the cases, the female was given the child. They also showed that the extenuating circumstances, if it was a woman, she was allowed to bring them up, whether there was any evidence of it or not. That in all of these cases, there was evidence that was prevented from being shown in court by the judges. Evidence that would show that a man was the one who was abused was prevented from being shown. They also showed that the way that the judges and the lawyers and everybody in the courts, when it came to a women's case, where a woman and a man, the two cases were very similar, no matter what, if it was the woman who was the aggressor in one and the man who was the aggressor in the other, the woman was still more likely to win in both of those cases. A man's evidence was denied in nearly all of those cases, and a woman's hearsay or slander was always allowed, or nearly always allowed. So the point there is that a man does not get the benefit of the doubt, a woman does. It never benefits a man to not be recording. You can see how the police treat me differently than they treat a woman. Obviously. Many of you men have noticed that the police treat me differently than they treat you when they come to your house. That's because you live in a house. When it comes to these men's hate groups passing as women's rights groups, you can't even get to the actual numbers and the actual statistics from a credible source without having to scroll for 20 minutes through a bunch of hate groups towards men. And we have to go to New Zealand, and also Canada does our statistics for us, just so you know. Because Americans, especially the American government, doesn't want to do those statistics, doesn't want to bring it up. And none of these domestic violence places that are trying to paint women as always the victims and men as always the predators, none of them are going to give that power up, knowing that now they have those special rights to destroy a man's life. Do you think a woman is really going to give that up? Do you think that she is really going to go, all right, between doing the right thing and using this little trick that allows me to steal the children from a loving parent because he has a penis, that is somehow magically okay? And the courts are going to do it, despite the fact that in many of these cases, nearly all of the cases where you have filicide by a mother, the mother was able to win a case of custody against a male with no evidence, no proof that he had any wrongdoing. They gave custody to the mothers, and within 6 months, the mothers killed their children. 6 months. The majority of these mothers who drown their children, beat their children to death, drowning in bathtubs, drowning them in pools, drowning them in lakes, drowning their children. And then, of course, these women's groups don't want to consider drownings, which is very common. They don't want to consider drowning to be a violent death. I don't know how many of you have ever been close to drowning. It's terrifying, and it is violent. So to say that women are less likely to kill their child violently is an outright lie. Matter of fact, between a ball-peen hammer to the back of the head and holding your own child underwater for 5 minutes, that's how long you have to hold your child underwater to make sure that they don't accidentally wake up and cough up what's in their lungs. You have to physically hold your child underwater for 5 minutes. Men are not likely to do that. They are far less likely to do that. For men, for many of us, images of violence against us in our lifetimes. When people are talking about getting violence as a solution, many of us who have had to live through it are against that. Many of us who have lived through racial violence are against racial violence of any sort, no matter which race you're doing it to. But also, I'm not about hiding instead of speaking up. Racism is racism, regardless of your skin color. That's right, regardless of your skin color. Now, one of the things that I'm really trying to get you to look at is just because women, man-haters, want to bury actual statistics and try to sell you a false narrative, doesn't mean that you have to be dumb enough to fall for it. It doesn't mean that you need to lay down and apologize for being born with a penis. Just because women tell you that you owe it to them, because women are being mutilated with their genitalia in foreign countries, I want you to stop and think to yourself, your body, your choice. How much choice did you have in being circumcised? Were you even old enough to say no? I'm willing to bet with the majority of you, the answer is no. You were not old enough to give consent to have your genitalia mutilated. When it comes to harm against men here, we get the excuse of, oh, well, women are still being harmed elsewhere. Well, guess what? Women are still being harmed here. Women are also making it worse for all of us. How so? By victimizing male victims for coming forward. Me Too is the worst thing to happen to the United States since what? Take your pick of the most disgusting things that the United States has ever been involved in. That's right. The Me Too movement is paramount to joining the Nazi Party. Me Too? Oh, not if the me is a male. That's why I say good to be rid of you. Thank you for coming to visit. Stay out of trouble or don't get caught. Remember, you are your brother's keeper. And your sister's too. And no victim left behind. Not because of gender. Not because of skin color. No victim. Fucking disgusting.